Would you be able to tell a true prophet of God from a false one? Next on the Prophetic Connection. This place, the Mount of Olives, very near. Fulfilling the prophecy, waiting for the day when the Messiah will come. Over my shoulder, the Golden Dome of the Rock, which was built in the 7th century. But 600 years before that, where the Dome of the Rock now stands, the temple of Herod once stood. And 1,000 years before that, the temple of King Solomon. One day, as Jesus was there with his disciples, they drew his attention to the beauty of this. It was an incredible structure, and he said to them, "One stone will not be left standing upon another that will not be thrown down." That prompted questions in their hearts, and so they asked of Jesus, "Tell us, when will these things take place?" That began the long discourse that we find in Matthew 24 and in Luke 21. And he said, "There will be many signs of my coming and of the end of the age." And he said there'll be wars and rumors of wars, earthquakes, pestilences in many different places. But he also said that false prophets will arise. And in verse 4 of Matthew 24, Jesus answered and said to them, "Take heed that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and will deceive many." Meaning, they will claim to be the Messiah, but they will not be the true Messiah. And then in verse 11, he adds, "Then many false prophets will rise up and deceive many." We need to know what is true from what is false, because by knowing what is true, we have a reference point. And if we don't know the truth about Jesus Christ, then we run the risk of being deceived by false prophets. That's the warning that Jesus gave in answer to the disciples' question. And false prophets will be prevalent in the age immediately preceding the second coming of Jesus Christ.
Why are false prophets so dangerous? And how do we identify them? Especially when Jesus specifically warned of their heightened activity in the days immediately preceding his return.
So how do we tell a true prophet from a false prophet? There's a couple of concepts that when you understand it, it's pretty easy to tell the difference. In Jewish law, by the way, one of the commandments of the 613 is you're allowed to test a prophet, but not too much. And prophecy can be divided into two kinds of categories. One is good prophecy and bad prophecy. What's the difference between the two besides one makes you smile, the other you need Prozac to deal with? The answer is good prophecy, bad prophecy is a warning. It can be avoided. Good prophecy has to happen. That means if someone comes along, and again, Maimonides, the great medieval Jewish philosopher, he actually, in his Laws of Kings, he talks about laws of prophets and false prophets, and how do you know the Messiah is the Messiah, because the Messiah is also a prophet. He says you could test him. You ask him for the good stuff. If the good stuff has to happen, if it doesn't happen, that person is a false prophet. But the bad stuff can be a warning, and much of false prophecy is designed to get people to do, as we say, tshuva, to wake up and avoid the bad stuff happening. That, by the way, is one of the understandings of why Jonah doesn't want to go to the city of Nineveh. He's afraid that they're going to listen, the stuff's not going to come true, and he'll be accused of being a false prophet. Or he's even more afraid that the Ninevians are going to listen, and the Jews are not listening, and it's going to make the Jewish people look really bad in the eyes of God. How come these Gentiles are listening and you people are not listening? But bottom line, the big deciding factor is to test that prophet and see if the good stuff they predict happens or doesn't happen. And if it doesn't happen, no matter what else they do, what other miracles they perform, they are a false prophet.
People everywhere have an inherent weakness where false prophets are concerned. They want to know what the future has in store.
I think one of the reasons why we are warned by Moses and others in the Bible against false prophets is the fact that they say, "Thus saith the Lord." They speak in the Lord's name. And there are a lot of people that can easily be manipulated by that. To ignore that would be, maybe I'm ignoring the Lord. Maybe he's trying to speak to me in this situation. And so that manipulation that happens by those who presumptuously say, this is what the Lord is saying to you. And it's a great danger. People can get right off track as they fear the Lord, so they want to hear what the Lord has to say. But then there are men and women who are false prophets. They are deceived, and they deceive many others.
I think there's a plethora, to use a big word, of false prophets, and most of the ones that I believe that I'm aware of, they don't understand Israel. They're prophesying about all kinds of things, and they leave Israel out. And I don't know how you can be a prophet in the end times and not see God's hand upon Israel and the significance and the centrality of the restoration and the revival of Israel, because Jesus is not coming back until the Jews turn to him. Satan knows it. Why don't these people, a lot of these people that call themselves prophets, realize it? That's what the scripture says. So when somebody tells me or comes here or sends me a book or something and they say they're a prophet, or people are saying they're a prophet, and they don't have a handle on Israel, I don't buy it.
Jesus called Satan, or the devil, the father of lies. Clearly, false prophets find fertile ground in an age when lies and deception have replaced truth and honesty.
In the distance, the Temple Mount, where the golden dome of the rock now stands, the temples once stood. During Jesus' ministry, he spent much time there teaching. And of course, his disciples followed him wherever he went. But one day in particular, he said to the disciples, not one stone of this, meaning this grand complex, will be left standing upon another. That statement shocked those disciples. So later that day, they came to him and they asked him, and they said, tell us, when will this be? What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? And the long answer, the discourse that he gave them, is recorded in Matthew 24 and a parallel passage in Luke 21. Listen to the words that are found in Matthew 24, beginning in verse 1. I'll give you the context. Then Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came up to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said to them, do you not see all these things? Assuredly, I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down. So then they came to him later that day, and they asked him the questions, when? So he began to give them the signs of the times, specifically the signs that would precede his second coming and of the end of the age. And he said this in verse 4, take heed that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will deceive many. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. We hear nothing but wars and rumors of wars these days. And then nation shall rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There'll be famines, pestilences, and earthquakes in various places. And all these are the beginning of sorrows, meaning of birth pains. And then he emphasizes the false prophets once again. He says in verse 11, then many false prophets will rise up and deceive many. So it's interesting, these references to false prophets are like bookends. He begins with them, then he gives the other signs about the famines, the pestilences, the earthquakes in many places, and he goes back again to the false prophets. But how can we tell a true prophet from a false one? Moses answered that question for us more than 3,000 years ago. In the book of Deuteronomy, in chapter 18, in verse 20, here's what Moses, he was speaking to the children of Israel, so he's telling them how to tell a true prophet from a false one. Verse 20, but the prophet who presumes to speak a word in my name, meaning God's name, which I have not commanded him to speak, or who speaks in the name of other gods, that prophet shall die. That's what Moses told the people. And if you say in your heart, how shall we know the word which the Lord has not spoken? In other words, how can we tell a true prophet from a false one? Moses gives the answer. When a prophet speaks in the name of the Lord, if the thing does not happen or come to pass, that is the thing which the Lord has not spoken. The prophet has spoken it presumptuously. You shall not be afraid of him. And the people would have been afraid of any prophet or perceived prophet that spoke, because the prophets had power to put curses on the people and bring catastrophe upon the nation if they chose to. But Moses is showing the distinguishing feature here, that true prophets, if they prophesy for God, what they prophesy comes to pass, whereas with false prophets, they can prophesy all day long and the thing will not come to pass. Now I go back to Matthew 24 because Jesus gives this teaching in the context not only of false prophets, but of false messiahs. And he says this in verse 26 of Matthew 24. Therefore, if they say to you, look, he, the Messiah, is in the desert, do not go out. Or look, he is in the inner rooms, perhaps thinking of the inner rooms in Jerusalem. Do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. For wherever the carcass is, there the eagles will be gathered together. And this seems to link the gathering together of the eagles, or if you like, the birds of prey, with the Battle of Armageddon, which is also synonymous with the coming of the Lord. So he putting the two things together. You will know when I come, because the sky will be filled with the glory of God. Every eye will see it. It will be a spectacular return. So when they tell you that the Messiah is in the desert, or he's in one of the inner rooms in Jerusalem or wherever, you don't believe that. My coming will be with signs and wonders, and it will be at the coming of Armageddon at the end of days, for the mother of all battles. Now, having talked about false prophets, we know that there will be two true prophets who will come. And they're mentioned in the book of Revelation, and the great panorama that Jesus revealed to John the Apostle. He was in his mid-90s, a prisoner on a Roman penal colony on the island of Patmos in the Aegean Sea, just off the west coast of what is today Turkey. And he saw the unfolding of history through symbols and visions that Jesus revealed to him. That's why it's called the book of revealing, the book of Revelation of Jesus Christ. But among the many things that John saw were these in chapter 11. Then I was given a reed like a measuring rod, and the angel stood saying, Rise and measure the temple of God, the altar, and those who worship there. But leave out the court which is outside the temple, and do not measure it, for it has been given to the Gentiles. This is an interesting statement, because when you look over my shoulder, you see the Temple Mount. That's what it's called, because that's where the Temple of Solomon and later the Temple of Herod stood. But today there is a Mosque of Omar, a Mosque of Islam, if you like. Muslims, Christians, we are Gentiles, we're not Jews. So we're being told here, and it seems to suggest that one day a new temple will be erected on that site. But of course this is a matter of interpretation. But why tell John to measure the temple if it isn't going to be there at some point in the future? And so he measures the temple, the part that, if you like, really belongs to the Jews, but don't bother measuring the Gentile area, because it's given over to the Gentiles. That's what we have today. The Gentiles, if you like, are on the Temple Mount. The temple's not there, so in a sense the Jews are not on the Temple Mount. Gentiles are. And it says they will tread the holy city underfoot for 42 months. That's about 3.5 years. And I will give power to my two witnesses, these two prophets that are to come, and they will prophesy 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth, as if to show their humility as prophets of Almighty God. And again, it's approximately 3.5 years. These are the two olive trees and the two lampstands standing before the God of the earth. And of course, they're mentioned as well in the book of Zechariah. And if anyone wants to harm them, fire proceeds from their mouth and devours their enemies. And if anyone wants to harm them, this is repeated, he must be killed in this manner. They have the power to shut heaven so that no rain falls in the days of their prophecy, and they have power over waters to turn them to blood, and to strike the earth with all plagues as often as they desire. Now we know that Elijah the prophet had the power to shut the heavens so that there was no rain. We know that Moses had the power to turn the rivers of Egypt to blood. So Moses and Elijah could do these things, but are they the two prophets that are symbolized here? I suppose we could say that Elijah certainly could be one of them, because the prophet Malachi said that Elijah must come before the days that Messiah comes. So by interpretation, we could say, well, one of them probably is Elijah, but the other one is a mystery, and some say Enoch or someone else. And there are many opinions about this, but I think that we leave it open to interpretation. The thing to see is that they are the prophets of God, true prophets who have God's power to do miracles in the sight of those that dwell on the earth, certainly in Jerusalem. And then it says in verse 7, when they finish their testimony, meaning when the time of their ministry is accomplished, 3.5 years, the beast that ascends out of the bottomless pit will make war against them, overcome them, and kill them. Now, who or what is this? Once again, we have interpretations and many different opinions. Some suggest this is a satanic angel that will arise out of an abyss. Others suggest that it could be the figure of the Antichrist, empowered by satanic angels. But once again, it's a matter of interpretation. What we need to see is the intention of this being, or this thing, is to kill these two prophets. And that's exactly what happens. And it says in verse 8, and their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city, which spiritually is called Sodom and Egypt. Now, why are these names? And that, again, is a matter of interpretation, but what comes next defines the location of Sodom and Egypt. Because it says, John says, where also our Lord was crucified. So it has to be Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is going to have two other names according to this passage. One will be Sodom, and the other is Egypt. And then it says in verse 9, then those from the peoples, tribes, tongues, and nations will see their dead bodies 3.5 days, and not allow their dead bodies to be put into graves. This is a sacrilege, because we should respect the dead. But their bodies will be allowed to lay in the streets of Jerusalem, and it seems the whole world will be able to see this. And of course, through satellite television imagery, today that's possible. In John's day, they had nothing like this, but we live in the technological age. So John is simply telling what he sees, what Jesus tells him to say, and of course we can see the fulfillment of the prophecy that people in John's day would have no idea what he is talking about. In verse 10, and those who dwell on the earth will rejoice over them, meaning over their deaths. Make merry and send gifts to one another, because these two prophets, true prophets, tormented those who dwell on the earth, which tells us about the depravity of the earth in that day and of people. They're going to rejoice over the killing, the deaths of God's true prophets. And there's more than that. It says in verse 11, in fact, let me go back to verse 10. It says they will rejoice over them, make merry, and send gifts to one another, because these two prophets tormented those who dwell on the earth. This is like a satanic counterfeit Christmas, exchanging gifts. But why? Over the deaths of the two servants of God who have witnessed in Jerusalem. And then in verse 11, now after the 3.5 days, the breath of life of God entered them. They stood on their feet, and great fear fell on those who saw them. And they heard a loud voice from heaven saying to them, come up here. So now the two prophets are summoned back to heaven. And they ascended to heaven in a cloud, and their enemies saw them. In the same hour, there was a great earthquake, and 1/10 of the city fell. In the earthquake, 7,000 people were killed, and the rest were afraid and gave glory to the God of heaven. The second woe is past. Behold, the third woe is coming quickly. In the unfolding of the revelation that John saw, we have increasing judgments that come from God upon the earth, and they seem to compound in effect all the way up until we reach Revelation chapter 19, which describes the Battle of Armageddon. And of course, Jesus, King of Kings and Lord of Lords, comes with the armies of heaven. And in that battle, the Antichrist, it is a day of reckoning for the Antichrist and for Satan, who empowers the Antichrist. And this all unfolds before us in the symbolism of John. How close are we to these events? Israel is a nation again, back in the land. And I believe that the prophetic clock is ticking faster. And we're seeing, certainly in the world, the signs that Jesus spoke of. We see the famines, the pestilences, the earthquakes in many different places. But we also see false prophets. We see many who claim to know the truth and to know the true way. But Jesus said, there's only really one way. I am the way, he said, the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except by me, meaning except by the cross erected outside the walls of Jerusalem, on which the Prince of Glory died. In the distance, the Mount of Olives, so familiar to Jesus and his disciples. Why? Because they spent so much time there. They could get away from the crowded streets of Jerusalem over there and find some time among themselves just to talk. It was there, somewhere there, that the disciples asked those profound questions. Jesus had said that the temple was going to be destroyed, that not one stone would be left standing upon another. And of course, they wanted to know, when will that be? So they asked him, tell us when these things will be. What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? You see the tall tower in the distance, that marks the summit of the Mount of Olives. But just beyond the tower, the village of Bethany, the home to Mary and Martha, two sisters, and their brother Lazarus. They were the friends of Jesus. He spent much time at their home. He came from that direction over the Mount of Olives on Palm Sunday. And he wept over the city when he saw it. Listen to the account in Luke chapter 19. Now as he drew near, he saw the city and wept over it, saying, if you had known, meaning Jerusalem, the inhabitants, even you, especially in this your day, the things that make for your peace. This is your day. I really am the Messiah, and I have come to you. But they didn't understand that. But now they are hidden from your eyes. And he goes on to talk about their enemies building an embankment around them, surrounding them on every side, and destroying Jerusalem in the process. Jesus had said earlier that it was not right that a prophet should die other than in the holy city at Jerusalem. And as he rode in triumph down the slopes of the Mount of Olives and through the eastern gate, in the midst of all that celebration, he knew in his heart that in a matter of days he would be crucified for the sins of the world.